I've always known that I wanted to be a painter. I had an uncle whom I liked very much, who used to sketch in the country and take me off on the back of his bicycle, you know. And I don't remember so much his paintings, but I remember the places where he cleaned his paint on the tree stumps and so on. They all became very special places for me. And I was completely hooked on the idea of painting. You know, I was always drawing. That's what I wanted to do.
From an early age, like 5?
I was born wanting to paint, and I did. One of the advantages of being a painter is that you don't have to know anything. You know, it happens in the moment, and those people who stuff themselves full of knowledge get into trouble. You know, much better to be ignorant and on the spur of the moment. Yes.
When and why and what decided you to go to Paris?
Well, Paris was the center of culture. It was the place where all painters of interest went to. You know. European culture, in fact, the human culture to a certain extent, was centered in Paris. All the new ideas came from Paris, you know. And that was the place to be. And it was international. And it wasn't that the French particularly liked artists, but they were very hospitable. And Paris was the most delightful place to live at that time. A great deal was permitted, which wouldn't have been permitted in England, certainly, you know. The French were very tolerant, very tolerant. And the most amusing people in the world were there. And England was stuffy, you know, and the art world in England had all kinds of conventions and prejudices and ideas about good taste and things like that. I arrived in Paris in 1937, and Surrealism was in this bit of a doldrums at that time, as was all modern art. You know, Cubism had happened, Expressionism, Impressionism, it had all happened, and there was a bit of a doldrums, you know, and there was a search for a new direction. Picasso was in a crisis. All the painters were in a crisis, you know, they didn't know where modern art was going. And so it was very exciting. And when I met Marta, we spent a whole summer, you know, talking about modern art and one thing and another. And we saw the direction, from our point of view, very clearly. And it was just an opportune moment, you know. And Marta had the nerve to go and meet the Surrealists. He put on his best suit and went with an elegant walking stick, you know, and with a few drawings to the Surrealists were in the De Magot, you know, café on Boulevard Saint-Germain, called the De Magot. And there were 2 tables, you know, about 10 people. And then there was another circle around, you know, they were the closest ones. And then there was another circle around that. And everything the Surrealists said had radiated out into Paris, you know. And there was an enormous ambition and interest in Surrealism. So Marta breached that ring of he had the nerve to go there. And later on, Breton said, you know, the most impossible young man came with the most marvelous drawings. And it didn't take long, though, for Marta to be accepted completely. He got an introduction from Salvador Dali. Of course, Dali, by that time, Salvador Dali was thrown out of Surrealism within weeks of my joining, you know. And when Dali came to America, he let it be known, or suggested, that he had invented Surrealism. And there are many Americans who believe that Dali invented Surrealism, you know. And so he didn't get a very warm welcome when he came back, and he was called to account for himself. You know. And he put on, I think, 17 sweaters and went to talk and gave a brilliant discourse, you know, about what he'd done in America, taking off a sweater, one sweater after another. But it didn't work. He was thrown out. And very soon after that, Martha had already been welcomed, you know. And very soon after that, Breton came to my studio, and I was absolutely astounded, you know. He said he thought that Martha and I were the most interesting young painters in Paris. Of course, we weren't very good, but we were original, you know. Martha was marvelous. His drawings were pure genius, you know, and he's never done anything better.
Where did you come after Paris?
Before the war, just the summer before the war, Breton and Tanguy and Martha and Esteban, we stayed together. We spent the summer together in a chateau. And we decided that it was far more important to go on with our painting than to do the war. The war was in the air, you know. And at that time, Tanguy had become estranged from his wife, Jeannette, and was courting Kay Sage, you know. And Kay Sage was the daughter of a senator. And so when the war started, she dashed back to Washington, and with other friends and one thing and another, they made a committee for the preservation of European culture. And we were all invited to come to America. It would have been impossible otherwise, you know, because all the frontiers were down. You couldn't bring any money or anything like that. And so we were all, one way or another, invited to come to America. And I suppose for propaganda reasons or one thing or another, we were allowed to go. I don't want to sound superior or anything like that, but there wasn't any culture in New York. It was entirely derivative from Europe. And it was a very homespun taste, you know. And the painters in New York used to wait for the art magazines from Europe, you know, and then that was the latest Matisse, the latest Picasso. That was the influence. That's right. So we were bringing something. This was the first time that a few painters and poets and writers from Paris had arrived en masse, and we were fated, you know, really. And that was the beginning of the life in New York and also in Los Angeles, you know. And there wasn't anything before. I was about one of the few people who spoke English, you see. And so I was asked to lecture at the New School for Social Research. I'd never lectured in my life. I didn't want to, but it fell to my lot, and I gave some lectures on Surrealism. And everyone of interest, you know, came.
Why did you leave New York for San Francisco?
Well, I found that it was impossible to work in New York, you know, because I had become a celebrity. And that's the worst thing that could happen, you know, because you're pestered. And I lectured at the Art Students League, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It went all over. And everyone wanted to know about Surrealism, and so I was trapped. And when I met my wife, Jacqueline, we decided to go to Mexico. And as soon as we could, we went down to Mexico and went to live in a small village with the Tarascan Indians. And we were there for almost 7 years. It was a great adventure.
how did you get from Mexico then to San Francisco? Why San Francisco and not Los Angeles?
Now, I don't want to get into California politics, but my wife was born in the foothills of the Sierra, you know, and at a little place called Angel's Camp. Her father was a doctor. And she lived in her family lived in San Francisco, were based in San Francisco, you know. And so the choice was in Mexico, whether I knew that Europe would take years to recover. It hasn't recovered yet, you know. And so the question was where to go, whether to go back to New York or whether to go to the West Coast. And we decided on the West Coast. And Jacqueline introduced me to California. You know, we went to the Sierra, we went to the desert, and we went all over the place. And I was completely enchanted. And so we chose this place because of the country, because of the countryside. It wasn't for intellectual reasons. There wasn't any intellectual life to interest us at all, you know, except from interest in Asia. And that was wonderful. But from the point of view of painting and art, there was nothing here, nothing. Zero. Of course, people painted and they were taught in art school to copy what had been done before, or all those ideas. But the spirit of creation hadn't taken hold. You know, there were just very, very few people.
You've been labeled as a surrealist, but then
I was a surrealist
you still
until I resigned.
You still consider yourself a surrealist?
No. I resigned in 1943.
How does one resign from surrealism? You just stopped working that way?
No, I wrote to Breton and told him that I was no longer a surrealist. I had deep respect, but I was no longer a revolutionary. You know, I didn't have time to occupy myself with all these politics. I was interested in investigating the unconscious. And that was a whole-time thing, whole-time work. The power that moves us in art comes from the invisible spirit world. It's not something which can be learned or seen a priori, you know. So the inspiration of a painter comes from the unconscious spirit, whether you know it or not. You know, what's original, what hasn't been seen before, comes from the spirit. And that's what has preoccupied me all my life, you know.
Talk a little, if you will, on Dynaton.
The Dynaton was, the word anyhow, was the invention of Wolfgang Paulin, you know. And he had a magazine in Mexico called Dyn, which was considered to be the most important art magazine during the war. It's a marvelous little magazine. And when we came to California, we sent glowing letters to Wolfgang, and he decided to come too, you know, to join us. And so we found him an appropriate house, a very beautiful house in Mill Valley, where he could show off some of his collection. And Paulin came. And at that time, there was a very sympathetic, cultured lady who was director of the Museum of Modern Art, Grace Morley. And I'd had a retrospective when I arrived here, you know, and she offered us a show at the museum. That was Paulin and Lee and myself, you know, and Paulin's theory, the Dynatron was entirely Paulin. That was his word, which had come from Dyn, and that was all his theory. You know. Before the Dynatron show, I had a retrospective at the museum, and we had a catalogue, and I said, towards a new subject in painting. I called it Towards a New Subject in Painting. And I didn't realize it was the new subject. I didn't have the courage to say that at the time, but it was actually the new subject, which is the investigation of the inner world, what I call the inner worlds. Which have always had an influence on art, and now we wanted to get at them directly. We are continuing surrealism on a deeper level, you know. And Dynatron is the first step towards the exploration of the inner worlds, you know.
Were there at that time other artists working with similarities to the Dynatron group?
Absolutely not.
Amazing. And have there been any since?
I think that we were before our time here, you know, and probably the influence is just starting now. I don't know.
And
it was a great sadness. We didn't have many friends. And Jacqueline introduced me, you know, to San Francisco Society. And we went around to cocktail parties and things like that. People in San Francisco love to give dinner parties and cocktail parties. They love to go to the opera. And we did all that for a bit. Until I got bored stiff. And we fled forever. One of the reasons we came to San Francisco, you know, was because it was on the Pacific. And their interest in the Orient. And Dr. Frederick Spiegelberg, you know, who wrote the book on world religions. You know, he was the Stanford. He was started a thing called the Asian Academy. He started the Asian Academy, and for the first time, spiritual masters were invited from Japan and China, India, and they taught at the Asian Academy. It never happened before. And I studied with a wonderful Hindu called Haridas Chaudhary, who introduced me to Vedanta, you know, so on and so forth. And that, for the first time, I was able to say something about what I was doing, you know. Before that, it had all been a mystery, and I was speechless, as most people are, you know, about the spirit. And then I've met wonderful Chinese people who studied the Tao, and there was a Japanese Zen master here who ran the Soto Zen temple, Hodo Tabasi, and he was a great calligrapher. And I went to study calligraphy with him, you know. And that was one of the most powerful influences in my life, you know. And he was a very simple man, and he got it. Certain people have got it, and other people haven't, you know. And we had a very profound relation. And so I had really a transmission into Zen, the spirit of Zen, you know, through calligraphy and just being with Tsubasi.
Have you done calligraphy?
Yes. I've got this wonderful piece of calligraphy right here. And I worked like a beaver for 5 years at calligraphy. And that is the basis of my art. And I found that I'd always unconsciously been interested in calligraphy, you know. But it took me 14 years to get to the line, circle, dot, which happened to be the fastest lines you can make, and the deepest language of the spirit.
What about the future?
I think art is going to have a greater impact than it ever has, you know, because the religions are, nearly all of them are in trouble one way and another. And the quest of the inner world is going to get at the spiritual aspect of the cosmos directly. And so it will have a growing influence. I do think that we have to have a closer relation with nature and with the spirit of the cosmos. And that's what art's about. You don't want to be encumbered with what you know. You've got to let the forces of creation work through you, you know, which means to have an open mind. I've always known that I wanted to be a painter. I had an uncle whom I liked very much, who used to sketch in the country and take me off on the back of his bicycle, you know. And I don't remember so much his paintings, but I remember the places where he cleaned his paint on the tree stumps and so on. They all became very special places for me. And I was completely hooked on the idea. And that was the place to be. And it was international. And it wasn't that the French particularly liked artists, but they were very hospitable. And Paris was the most delightful place to live at that time. A great deal was permitted, which wouldn't have been permitted in England, certainly, you know. The French were very tolerant, very tolerant. And the most amusing people in the world were there. And England was stuffy, you know, and the art world in England had all kinds of conventions and prejudices and ideas about good taste and things like that. I arrived in Paris in 1937, and Surrealism was in this bit of a doldrums at that time, as was all modern art. You know, Cubism had happened, Expressionism, Impressionism, all.
When and why and what decided you to go to Paris?
Well, Paris was the center of culture. It was the place where all painters of interest went to, you know. European culture, in fact, the human culture to a certain extent was centered in Paris. All the new ideas came from Paris, you know. The idea of painting, you know. I was always drawing. That's what I wanted to do.
From an early age, like 5?
I was born wanting to paint, and I did. One of the advantages of being a painter is that you don't have to know anything, you know. It happens in the moment. And those people who stuff themselves full of knowledge get into trouble, you know. Much better to be ignorant and on the spur of the moment, yes.